There's no point us talking about the problems and more problems and the impacts of the problems and then showing some solutions with some way of doing it, because we know that a lot of our audience resourcing is a challenge. So the only way forward in many cases is to collaborate, and we try to help as much as possible on that. But if we talk about some of the benefits of collaboration before we demonstrate some examples, Neil, talk us through this slide about the benefits of collaborating on climate.
Yeah, well, the key one is for boards is to improve your governance and your strategy. And bear in mind that many organizations have been through this journey before. Some will be ahead. And there is the potential to, because of that, access more effective and potentially lower cost solutions. And I've given some examples in that slide. But have a look at those organizations nearby that have got, because they've got similar problems when it comes to climate change and the challenges of emissions reductions. Look for those potential partners in health, but in other sectors. And I use water as an example because water has been dealing in climate risks for decades now, and they've got some really good risk mitigation capabilities.
You're referring to water boards and those statutory authorities that we have here, at least in Victoria, probably across Australia. Yep, great. We will get to that because it's down the track in our slides. But Fee, this is a really interesting slide here, how we can start thinking from a board point of view, the appointments. And as we always say, the next 5 years, your strategic plan, you've got to have an exec and a board team that's got the skills and capabilities to execute the next 5 years, not necessarily the last 5 years. If this is a foreseeable risk, it might make sense to start bringing some of this expertise onto the board.
Yeah. What this means, Wes, is that we need to have this expertise at the table when these discussions happen. And there's a couple of ways you can do that. If it's not possible to have those skills in your actual director, you can bring them on to your board subcommittees, and they can speak to your risk and audit committees, and that information can come back up to the board. They can be guests at your planning days. But my best advice is you actually need to know, what do you look like at the moment? What do you already have in place? What are the skills of those sitting around the table? And then look at those gaps and then go, okay, what are our choices? But be prepared to be non-traditional in who you have sitting around the table, because it will save you hours of discussion having experts in these particular areas.
And you might be surprised, I think, Fee, you may have seen it in our data. Sometimes the expectation is there's no skill or capability, but until you do a comprehensive assessment, and then all of a sudden you realise you've got someone on your team already you don't have to go and recruit for or develop for, but until a chair or a company secretary or a CEO is aware that's there. Now, we want to talk about the non-traditional. We did touch on water corporation. I think this is a really exciting slide. Neil, you're going to help us out here because you led on this during preparation, non-traditional approaches and what they're looking like right now.
Yeah, I mentioned the water corporations before. They're key, not just in understanding the waterways, which is really important, but also their path towards reducing carbon emissions, transition to renewables, of which they partner with many organizations with which to do those things. And as I said before, they're leading in this area. The traditional owners here, yeah, good one here, cultural burning plans. And of the fires we had 2019, 2020, one of the key recommendations from the Royal Commission that followed that was to capture this traditional knowledge and that the valuable way of doing things differently. So the strong relationships with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities working together on strategic projects and business partnerships. I know there are some boards around that now have Aboriginal people on their boards, and they're already given extreme value to those organisations.
I love it. I love it. And of course, local councils, Fee, they spend a lot of money already doing a lot of these things. We can certainly access a lot of that data. It's IP that our customer base could use to help break the bank of a lot of that expensive applications, I think.
Exactly. So one of our key roles, and interestingly, one of the top areas that our board reviews have highlighted, Wes, is a low score around key stakeholder engagement. And so a lot of boards are going back out and going, who are our most important key stakeholders? And we are looking very non-traditionally at who we need to work with in order to even understand this risk. Who do we have around the table? And working with local government is absolutely essential. And there were some brilliant examples of those partnerships during COVID, where in a heartbeat on local football ovals, entire testing stations were set up. So we can do it, but let's not think about it just because there was an emergency. Let's think about it and be proactive.
Love it. Thank you. And of course, the obvious collaboration is there's a lot of experts out there, and I've deferred to Aon because I've got personal experience with their expertise. Their modelling is incredible, and it's not just Aon. There's plenty out there. I'm not advocating just for them. I'm advocating that there's a lot of work already being done in that space, and they're pricing risk as a commercial product. Neil, let's talk about that, but also the different types of experts, because it is a broad church to a degree, and it could be overwhelming to anyone in our audience. Let's break it down, what our audience could be looking for to get the best practice there.
Sure, Wes. And I'd like to amplify what you said, that there's an enormous amount of information already out there, work done on risks. And for your audience, I'm very happy to point them towards work that will be done in there. And I think that's a great place to start. We don't want to reinvent the wheel here. You might find that a lot of the work's already been done, so you don't have to engage any expertise. But in my field, particularly those who are, we say climate risk management, but this is all about taking the perspective from the organization. Every organization is different here. And I think a mistake probably that I made earlier in my career was to take it from a top-down climate focus here, whereas it's actually bottom-up. What really matters materially for the organization, and then what climate-related risks are actually important in that context. But we can bring in the modeling, the projections. Scenario development is really, really important, because we don't know exactly how that future is going to plan out, especially when we're talking about decades ahead. But what we can do is present a number of different scenarios with which to explore your risks.
And do you think, Neil, even prior to talking to the experts, you could probably access some completed work at a local government level just to get the conversation started at board level? Go, this is what this organisation believes best practice. Start to understand the frameworks, the language, how to talk about it, and identify. Is that one way of getting started?
Definitely, yeah. I'd certainly advocate for that. And also what Fee said in previous comment, assess your current understanding and knowledge of the situation. Great place to start.
And that's
what Neil, I 100% support that, because when we do our governance reviews, and under risk, we now have the contemporary questions, and we talk about environmental and social governance, and the board are marking themselves down. But what we say is, ask your CEO and your executive to give you a presentation on what you're already doing, because 9 times out of 10, the organisations are doing fabulous things. But there's this lack of knowledge between the groups, and then the board can lead on who should be our stakeholders around this. So it's a really simple and important strategy.
Really good point there, Fee. And of course, that's what Boardroom Plus does. As you can see right there is board review and director skills assessments. So thank you very much for that. Now, where does climate sit in governance, Fee? Is it subcommittees? Is it the risk? Let's talk to this, because it's ultra important before we talk about the poll results.
It's like all things, Wes, that are now top risks. It sits everywhere from a governance perspective. It needs to be discussed in your strategy. There needs to be the words, just not doing any harm to patients. Clinical governance needs to sit in the words, and the words around our management of this needs to sit in our strategy. it's not just to sit in the risk register, it could get lost in there. And even if it's a faraway risk, it needs to be discussed now because it's a foreseen risk. It needs to be an agenda item at our boardroom table. Whether we like it or not, it's here. And so we do need to discuss it. And as directors, we need to be curious about it. We're not saying we have the answers, but we need you to be curious about this. Forget about whether it's here or not. We need to be curious about it. Whether or not it sits in our audit and risk committee, you need to decide where it sits. And some organisations have committees such as sustainable committees, and it sits in there. But whereas it needs to be everywhere because it needs to be something that we're always thinking about.